So we're going to have two respondents who are scientists, and they will sort of react and comment on what they've heard so far. We have like 40 minutes before the coffee break. And I thought that within these 40 minutes, we will also bring in the audience. So wouldn't you like to know the audience a bit?
Yes.
Yeah, let's ask a few questions.
Okay.
What about how many butterfly experts? How many of you in here are butterfly experts? We could even do like one, it's a good room for standing up, sitting down exercises. So everybody who is a butterfly expert, please stand up.
So you got the cabbage butterfly joke. Yay.
Yeah. So good. Thanks. Sit down, please. So how many of you in here view yourself as biodiversity experts? Please stand up. It should include the butterfly people, right?
Cool. Yeah. I would notice that. They're all staying there.
Okay, sit down.
Oh.
So if we had like an exercise and I threw you out here in the Swedish nature, how many of you would be able to identify more than 100 species of plants or animals and animals?
Wow.
More than 100 species.
Wow, that is impressive. Woo! All right.
Okay, sit down, thanks. It's the sort of heritage from Linnaeus in Sweden. It's interesting that some of them who stood up, they didn't stand up when I said, are you a biodiversity expert? I think if you know 100 species, come on.
Yeah.
It's enough.
I'll call you an expert.
Okay, thanks. Then we know you a little bit. Okay, so we will have the two respondents. And please, Lisen Schultz and Alexandre Antonelli, could you please join us here on stage? Okay, so Alexander, you are a professor in systematics and biodiversity from Gothenburg University, and you are also the director of the, let me see if I get this right, the Gothenburg Global Biodiversity Center. I love your center because you have 13 different partner organizations, and you work not only with the sort of science, but also with education and preservation and public communication of biodiversity science. I wish we had something similar here in Stockholm. Let's fix that afterwards. I know that there are many experts here. You are also a Wallenberg Academy Fellow, and you're a member of the Young Academy of Sweden, etc. You have a long CV. So you will be the first respondent. Give him a big applause again, please. And I will give Alexander like 7 minutes, but let's say something about Lisen first. Lisen, you have a PhD in Natural Resources Management from Stockholm University. You're one of the theme leaders at the Stockholm Resilience Center here at Stockholm University, where you deal with biosphere stewardship. I think you will talk more about that soon. You have been an expert member in the UNESCO Man and the Biosphere Program Strategy Group and worked a lot with biosphere reserves, which is part of the UNESCO Man and the Biosphere Program. You have also worked a lot bridging science to policy and science to business, and even started a foundation to make sure that businesses move in the right direction. So big applause for Lisen as well. So 7 minutes to Alexander, 7 minutes to Lisen, and then, of course, Camille, you will be able to respond to the responses. And then I will gather some questions from the audience, and then we'll see what happens, basically. So please, Alexander, the floor is yours, or if you want to be having the floor from here, perhaps.
That's fine.
Do we have a clicker, or can I be the human clicker otherwise? Please.
Okay, so thanks very much, Fredrik, for the kind introduction. I feel the pressure on my shoulders now. And thanks so much, especially to you, Professor Parmesan or Camille, for the fantastic talk. I think on behalf of everyone here, it was an amazing synthesis of such a complex and important topic for our societies today. And I'm so happy that this subject is actually focus of today's lecture, because we've been talking about climate change for many years now, but biodiversity is just as important a topic and one of the major societal challenges. I'd like to follow up on your talk in terms of understanding what will happen to the future, because I think that's something that concerns all of us in our future generations as well. And we all know that it's extremely difficult and complex to foresee and predict what's going to happen in the future. I'd like to bring in another perspective, because we are sharing this planet with about 7 or 8 million other species. not including bacteria. And that's an amazing biodiversity. You can spend your whole life in the jungle looking for new species, and you won't be able to make it. And, but we also have to realize that although we have this amazing diversity on this planet, it's only about a lot less than 0.01% of all species that have lived on this planet before. So most species have already gone extinct. And my question here that I'm going to focus on is what can we learn from the past to better understand the future? And I'll just show you a couple of examples. This is a study looking at ferns, and you see some ferns here just in front of the speaker where we're speaking, Camille. And if you think that ferns are boring, you're wrong, because they are one of the most exciting and one of the best survivals of all organisms on this planet. They've been around for about 400 million years. They're much tougher than any dinosaurs or mammals for that part. And ferns have been diversifying, creating new species, but also dying out at an amazing pace. And in this graph here, we show some of the fossil and living relatives of ferns. And here you can see in a time scale from today, 0 up to 400 million years ago, how different lineages of ferns have diversified. And some of them were very, very diverse in the past. And then nowadays, we just have a few species left. And we can also see that from looking at DNA trees, so evolutionary trees, which compare how different species have speciated through time. And the question we can see here is how has extinction taken place among ferns or any other organism? And this graph just shows how the extinction rates of ferns have changed through time. And this is a time scale, again, from 400 million years ago up to the present. And here, how many species have gone extinct. And what we can see here is very large variations. So the question that we can be posing is what's driving those extinctions? And one of the things, when you compare many different factors, of course, is that temperature is one of the main drivers of extinction among ferns. The other one being interactions with other plants, in this case, gymnosperms. So what we can see here is that temperature does have a very substantial effect, and basically it's something that has gone on for hundreds of millions of years. In another study where we're looking at plants in South America, where most of my research in that of my group is focused, we've been studying how speciation and extinction varies through time and what's the relation to temperature change. And what you can see here is the temperature curve for the last 15 million years, and this is the extinction curve for the same group of plants. It's about 600 species, amazingly beautiful plants in the Andes of South America. And what we can see here is a very strong correlation between temperature change and extinction. So my last slide is showing a bit of a complex figure, but you don't have to focus on the details. But what it shows here is one of the most comparable events of climate change that we had in the past. You have to go back as far as about 56 million years back in time, just after the dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. And during this time, temperatures rose about 5 to 6 degrees in a period of about 10,000 years. So it was much faster. We know that the scale is really the big difference here, but it was a global warming that we haven't seen before. And what happened here is that this part of the graph shows all the different kinds of pollen you had before the warming, and then the red line here shows the period of warming, global warming, and then everything afterwards is what happened afterwards. So what you can see here in this transition at 56 million years ago, a very long time ago, is that we have a whole bunch of species that were very common before the warming and decreased. But we even have some many species that actually just appeared out of nowhere, the light blue ones, and those that increased in abundance, so the number of individuals of species through time. And there was a fourth group which didn't really care about the climate change. So what we can see here is a complex picture showing that it's been a very different impact of climate change, and there were winners and there were losers. So finally, I think that what I wanted to convey with those slides is that organisms, different groups of plants and animals, they have responded very differently to climate change. And that's something that we really conveyed very well, Camille, by showing that some species were actually not moving towards the poles, but actually down the hills. And we really have to understand this complexity in predicting the future. But then my second question is, what can we learn from the past, and sometimes the deep past, millions of years ago, to better predict the future? So that was the questions to you.
Thank you. I think we will actually sort of wait for you to respond to that question and listen to Lisen first. So keep that thought that you had and sort of wait for Lisen's response as well, and then we take it from there. Lisen, please.
Thank you, Fredrik, and thank you, everyone, for this afternoon, and especially you, Camille, for a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot already, and I look forward to our shared discussion. I will take a different entry point to complement your perspectives. But I first want to say that I bring with me the advice to, one, go wild, and two, go to the pub. I think those two are really good advices that I'll take from the professor for the weekend at least. And linked to that, I think what you do is that you find a way of conveying this message to people. And people are actually the ones who will have to act on the information that you're providing and the knowledge that you're providing. And you said that you wanted this talk to go from the sense of doom to a more hopeful message on where you can actually act. And I think a big conclusion that can be drawn from your research and the presentation today is that we also need to add humans into the picture to make science really work for action. And so at the Stockholm Resilience Center, we have this focus on social ecological systems, and that's a concept that tries to convey that all ecosystems today are actually shaped by human actions. But also that all humans are dependent on the ecosystems. So that we are really interconnected, and we have to find ways of studying them as a whole. We also, I think you also show very clearly how the local is linked to the global, and how there are no places today that are isolated from what's happening on a global level in terms of warming, for example. Which means that when we address conservation, we need to think about how to do this at multiple levels and engage from the local practitioner to the global policymaker. So the social ecological systems, the connection across scales, and then the complexity. And you told this story about how the climate scientists think they're so complex, and then you add life into the picture and it becomes even more complex. But then, of course, if you also add humans into the picture, it becomes even more complex. You need to find ways of understanding both how the ecosystem evolves and how people are motivated and able to take care of the ecosystems. And that brings me into the concept of biosphere stewardship. And it's a field that we've worked on for the last few years. And there was recently a paper coming out from the center that tried to look at what stewardship actually is. And it's a combination of care, knowledge, and agency. So it's about caring for a place and its species and biodiversity. It's about the knowledge of knowing how what these species need, and then about agency, so the capacity to act, so to have regulations in place and funding in place, etc., that actually enables action on this care and knowledge. And what I would like to discuss more is how we improve that or how we maintain stewardship and motivation for stewardship and capacity to act when we take that leap from the local to the global. Because when you look at what people are motivated about, it's not only the ecosystem services and the rational reasons, because that we get food and pollination and water and all these things that are important, but it's also a motivation connected to sense of place, to care for this area that you grew up in and so on, and also the fascination that you connected to with your ferns, the love for these specific species. So how do we maintain stewardship when we take that leap from the local to the global? Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So definitely moving between scales here. What can we learn from the past and sort of the science on how species reacted to climate change in ancient times, and also going from the local to the global and maintaining that sort of level of stewardship and actually making people care about the global whole. Big challenges.
So, no
Please,
problem.
Professor Parmesan.
But I loved your bringing in the paleo aspect, and one of my thrills with moving from a traditional biology department to a geology department at University of Texas at Austin is that's where the paleobiologists are. And we have these kind of conversations all the time. What can we learn from past major climate changes? And I think one of the difficulties is they are all a little bit different because the CO2 levels, the ocean currents, where the land masses are, it's, you can't quite make a perfect analog of the next few hundred years in any past way. So you have to kind of look. It's not easy. We can learn some lessons, but at least I don't know anyone who's found the perfect analog for the coming few hundred years. It would be great if we could. But so what lessons can we learn? Well, we can learn a lot. We can learn that with small amounts of climate change during the Pleistocene, you had glaciers covering Europe versus now. So that's, to us, that's a big climate change, but in the grand scheme of things, that actually is relatively small. And we know that you don't have a lot of extinctions. If you keep it within that sort of window, you tend to get a lot of movement of species around the globe, community reshuffling, but you don't tend to get a lot of extinctions. But if you shift greater degrees than that, where before we went into the Pleistocene, which is a cold Earth, we had a hot Earth going back, say, 4 million years. And when we went from that hot Earth down to this sort of general cold Earth, we did have large numbers of extinctions. So I think one thing we can learn is, yes, life, biodiversity can handle some fairly big shifts, but there's a limit. You get over that limit, you have a massive extinction, and it takes about, 3 million years, 4 million years before you start really seeing a new diversification of life. So as a conservation biologist, I have many hats. So as a conservation biologist, I think, I don't want to see my butterflies go, right? I love them, they're beautiful. I want my nieces to have the experience of snorkeling in a tropical coral reef. And we're losing that ability pretty rapidly. And I literally am telling them, look, for your Christmas present, I'll give you a trip to a tropical coral reef, but go see it now, because in 10 years it may not be there. And a lot of the reefs I used to snorkel in they're all bleached. They're no longer any good. So that immediacy is, you don't want to see these losses in your lifetime or in your children's lifetime. And to prevent that, we need to keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is only another half a degree. We've already had 1 degree. It's only another half a degree. We start getting above that, our children lose the experiences that we had when we grew up, of the kind of walking through a forest, going on a beach and snorkeling. Those experiences will not be possible if we get above 2 degrees for many of the systems that we love. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. But the other thing I think that the lesson we learn is life will be fine on Earth. We may be going into another mass extinction event, but the Earth has recovered from many mass extinction events. It takes a few million years, okay, but it recovers. It's humans that we need to worry about. And that's what I think a lot of the people making policy don't get. All right, I'm a conservation biologist, I'm telling you about the biodiversity, but really, in truth, I'm far more worried about humans, my children, grandchildren, than I am about life in the big picture, because we know life will continue, life will evolve. life has an amazing capacity to bounce back from massive extreme events.
So this comes back to the motivation point that Lisen was asking about, perhaps. How do we motivate people to care about the global scale in that sense? Not only talking about what we will lose, but actually what we can gain if we invest in natural capital and the kind of ecosystem services we get back. Any responses to the response to the responses? Alexandre?
Of course, it was a very good question. I think there are several challenges in terms of the synergy of effects, both when it comes to climate change, but also habitat loss and other pathogens, invasive species, that we haven't really had any equivalents in the past. But also think it would be a pity not to look into the past, because those events have happened before, and I just wish that there will be a bit more integration of evolutionary biology into the conservation that we're facing now in the future. So yeah, I fully agree with you. It's a very complex task, but also think we should be looking to the past a little bit more, perhaps.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I think the conference, we need to have more joint conferences. Instead of, you go to your conferences, I go to mine, and I talk to you on stage, it would be good to be talking in the pub.
In the pub would be better.
Yeah.
And listen, that's very similar to what the Stockholm Resilience Center is trying to do, the transdisciplinary meeting across disciplines. So any response to the response of the responses?
No, I think that just as we need the diversity of life for the resilience of our biosphere and our life support systems, we actually also need this diversity of perspectives and knowledges, because we all have pieces of the puzzle. And then there needs to be even more work, I think, around how you have that deeper meeting between the different both disciplines and, focus on times and species and geographies and so on, so that you can truly learn from each other.
Well, I did want to make one comment on that. So everyone knows we need to be multidisciplinary. It's really hard.
Yeah.
I mean, I have done it. So my first big meta-analysis of global impacts of climate change was done with an economist, and that paper developed out of IPCC arguments. I'll be honest, we were arguing about, what's the bullet we're going to put in the summary for policymakers, and I wanted to say, we have high confidence that climate change has already impacted wild species, and the other two biologists who were on the team. And the economist said, "Oh, you can't say that. You're cherry picking. It's all correlational." Da 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 da. So it was hard, and literally, we'd go in the evening and start drinking. And it's like, okay, we're going to talk about something else, and you talk about something else. And finally, about 2 a.m, it gets around to, so how come you think you can talk about impacts that way? And it took 2 years for that paper to develop. And it wasn't the putting together data. That wasn't okay, so that took a couple of months. The 2 years was actually our going back and forth, talking, and it was before Skype, so we had to talk on the phone and see each other. And before we could actually come up with a set of text we could agree on. And it's a lot of give and take. A lot of, okay, I understand now. I understand your viewpoint. But this is why I don't think we should have that in the paper. And you have to like each other. You have to not just respect each other intellectually. You have to like each other, because you're saying, everything you've learned all your life is maybe not quite right. It's hard. Yeah. And so these transdisciplinary conferences, I think that's a great start, but you need the conversation to be much more long-term than that. You need to have an ongoing dialogue, one-on-one with the same people, so that you get to know each other. I had to learn economics. He had to learn ecology. I mean, literally, it's like, okay, tell me, what is capitalism? How does this work?
It's so interesting, because we have a long history in this house of people working together from ecology and economy. So the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics, and you mentioned Paul Ehrlich, who has been part of that as well, and it's connected to the Stockholm Environment Institute, and actually a part of the Stockholm Resilience Center. So that kind of collaboration is challenging, but extremely important. I
It's
think,
extremely
for
important.
science that can really have an influence on policy.
Yeah,
So-
but you have to really want to do it, and you have to be highly motivated,
Yeah.
and you have to just say to yourself, I am going to make this work. Because if you're kind of being a bit lazy and expecting it to just happen,
Yeah.
no, it's
We
not
have a
gonna just
strategy
happen.
to bring them out on an island. And Buzz
Very
Holling,
good.
who is the father of
With
the
no
resilience,
boats.
the father of resilience theory, Buzz Holling, he was talking about scientists who are good on islands, island people, that you can actually come together on an island and collaborate across disciplines. So that's perhaps an advice.
That's
He
good.
said they laugh hard and they work hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So we need some questions from you guys in the audience. And there's a microphone somewhere, or two microphones, or one microphone. So raise your hand and we'll see if we can gather 3 different questions to the panel. Anyone? Don't be shy. We have one up here. We start with Louise.
Thank you so much, all 3 of you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I wonder, you were talking about agriculture, but I'm directing the question to all of you. So what do you think is the single most important policy measure that we need to take right now within the agriculture and food industry to address conservation and the biodiversity issue?
The
Oh,
single
really
most
good one.
important.
See if we can get 2 more questions, and so think about your responses. It's an easy one, right? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Right, so there's about, sorry, maybe take the next one, I'll come back.
Okay. Another question then? Yes. So please say your name and where you're from.
Okay, my name's Adam Porter. This dealing with the public, and this, even the issue between the biologists and the economists and putting your paper together, there seems to be an ignorance gap, an ignorance mountain or a knowledge gap or something between your worldview and theirs. Ultimately, the policy is going to end up going through the public. And so it seems like there's probably a bigger knowledge gap that needs to sort of be, education gap that needs to be surmounted. And how bad, what's that gap really look like? How different is the public view, and what do we need to be able to teach the public to even to be able to put the questions in context for them?
Okay, thanks. So do we have a third one? Are you ready now? No?
Yep, sorry about that. So I was wondering about the sort of, is there a conflict between preserving biodiversity and preserving human society? If we've established that humans are ultimately what's at risk and life will go on without us, and if we're trying to keep people around, like the farmers in Germany who are using this hay technique that's devastating for biodiversity. I mean, food security is an impending issue as well. And they're probably doing that for some productivity reason, some efficiency reason. So how, is that a false dichotomy, or is there a conflict between preserving human food security and the security of human society versus preserving biodiversity?
Okay, thanks. Some huge questions here. We had the first one about the single most important policy measure to sort of deal with food and biodiversity
wanting me to
conservation.
take
And
them?
yeah, that's one of them. The other one was about the ignorance gap, or the sort of public view and the scientist view, and how we sort of how bad is that gap and what can we do about it? And the last one was about the major conflict between biodiversity conservation and humans.
Yeah.
Is there one? Or
But since
can we do
2
both?
of them are about agriculture,
Yeah.
I'm actually going to talk about the education one first,
Yeah.
because this does come up. And I've given talks to high school teachers, people in the business of educating children. And we talk about it, and they're like, well, we have to teach them math and language, English or Swedish or whatever. We have to do that. And yet it seems like we need to be teaching them environmental science at an early age when they're like 10 years old. So they say, we're supposed to now be teaching them everything, from age 5. How can we possibly do this? And so it is a real problem. There's no super simple answer. But the teachers I've seen who are being really successful with young kids, like 8, 9, 10-year-olds, they're teaching them the math and the English and the basics, but they're using part of the day to sort of have, say, a little herb garden or a biodiversity garden. One school is into traditional pecan trees in Texas are going extinct, the very traditional varieties, the native varieties, and they plant pecan trees out. So what they're doing is they're doing practicals, so kind of laboratory type stuff, that by doing it, you're training them in the connectivity between human society and the environment. What benefit do we get from a healthy environment? How do we preserve biodiversity? Rather than sort of making it class lecture. And that's where I think it's really working. It's the fun time. It's maybe even on Saturdays. And the kids are really learning it. So I give the kind of lecture I've given today to 10-year-olds, and their questions are brilliant. I get them saying, well, so aren't humans just going to go extinct? I'm like, how am I supposed to answer that? And the kids can handle it better than we can. They're like, right, okay, we got to get on board this. Looks like we're going to go extinct. We better do something about climate change. Okay, you be president. You go for it. So they can handle complex thinking at a very young age. And it really just, I think, it's a practical matter. How do you give them their basics, but also start giving them some of this, environmental science education, maybe not in a gentler way than when you're older. So I think it can be done, but I'm not saying it's easy. So
I think that Alexandre has a sort of comment on that as well, because you're into education with your biodiversity center.
Yeah, exactly. So, for instance, tomorrow I'll be teaching for 150 students in Gothenburg. And I'm actually surprised every time I do that, because there are only like 3 or 4 people who know anything about biodiversity among those 150 students. And I must say that, for instance, in the Swedish context, the only requirements in the curriculum between year 1 and 6 at schools, that Swedish school kids, they have to learn a few species, and it doesn't specify how many species. It doesn't specify in which way they should know about species. And back to your question, Fredrik, how many people here would stand up because they know more than 100 species? It's not a representative part of society, so you really have to know that. And it's a bit scary when we think everyone supports biodiversity, and that's a good thing, we have to fight for it, but very few people really are able to tell apart different species in nature. And I think it's something that we really have to work together with our kids, our society, and our curricula at schools as well, requiring a higher level of understanding what biodiversity is and how to identify species. Because if you don't know anything about species, you won't be able to protect them.
And listen, I know that you try to train business people. Is that tougher than training the 10-year-old?
Well, we'll see. It happens in November for the first time. But what I think has been quite clear is that you have to use a different language if you're talking to policymakers and business people versus if you're talking to kids and citizens. But also that policymakers and business people are also humans. So actually, the care and love for nature and life and biophilia and so on is there as well, deep underneath this quite rational surface. But I wanted to also add the importance of thinking about how we treat our urban nature, because that's where most kids today actually get their interaction with species. And we have studies showing how important it is for kids to have a small urban park nearby your daycare is going to change a lot how you think about nature. And it doesn't have to be super biodiverse, spectacular, but to have some trees, some bushes, some insects, some plants makes a huge difference.
Did we have anything on the single most important policy measure within agriculture? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I'll speak to both questions because I think they're really both about agriculture. Modern agriculture has been wonderful for increasing yield, And that's, adding fertilizer, new hybrid seeds that have higher yield. And it's been wonderful for increasing meat production, lots of feed for cattle and sheep and pigs and whatnot. But we are already starting to see the downside. So increasingly, insects are becoming insecticide resistant. This is now a big problem. It's something that's been around a while, and ecologists have been warning about it for a long time. But it is now a big problem that you can throw on so farmers are throwing on more and more insecticide. It's like that's not really the solution. So we have to do something different in terms of pesticides. With climate change and sort of the typical way of doing modern agriculture, which is, so modern varieties are selected very strongly for yield. The way that they can get high yield is that you give them plenty of fertilizer, you keep the pest off, so you're putting them in a bubble. You irrigate them, you're putting them in this bubble where they've got lots of resources, and then you can select genetically for these very, very high yields. It turns out that those same varieties are very vulnerable to climate change. So what is happening now is geneticists are inputting genes from the wild related species into, say, tomatoes, et cetera, to be able to create hardier varieties, varieties that are more resistant to a more variable climate. Year to year variability is increasing, both in temperature and in precipitation, and yield goes down, okay? You can't have it all ways. So in order to get crops, even if we're just thinking of feeding humans, even if we don't care about biodiversity, we are gonna have to start developing crops that have more genetic diversity, are more hardy, able to handle these climate extremes that are increasing every year, and able to be more resistant to pest on their own without relying on massive insecticides, massive pesticides, and resistance to rust and mold and all the other things that attack plants. And we're having to do that anyway, right? Just to keep the human production up, because the kind of selection we've done has created really weak plants. They're not very healthy, if you want to think of it that way. They need too much pampering. And we can't pamper them anymore because now all the insects have evolved to deal with the insecticide, and climate change is causing extreme years everywhere pretty much. And so in order to keep human global food up, we need anyway to go to more sustainable agriculture, I would argue. And then on top of that, so the hay meadows with the rolling the hay up in the plastic, one reason they do that is because it starts a fermentation process, and fermented hay gives you bigger cows. You get greater growth of your cattle. Well, I'm from Texas, I know cattle. Maybe it does it with sheep and goats too, but for cattle, you get better growth. You get better yield from your cows if you feed them this kind of semi-fermented hay. But at the same time, if you're thinking sustainable feeding, I'm not against eating meat. I think actually, we are evolved to eat meat as human beings, but getting balance into our diet with having the little bit of meat that we need to be healthy, we can do with traditional agriculture, traditional ranching, without having these modern ranches where they're fed fermented food and kept in barns and just, fattened up, basically, for the slaughter. So we don't need to produce anything like the amount of meat we're producing globally in order to have healthy populations. And so you could do away with the plastic packaged hay, have just traditional ranching methods where you have either grazing or traditional hay meadow cutting. We'd still raise plenty of meat for our global populations to be healthy, and it would be less than we have now, but you'd have a much more sustainable agriculture. So I think all of this is doable.
Yeah. So eating less meat, being a flexitarian, that somebody calls it, and going for some diversity that is actually lost in the sort of practices we have in industrial agriculture is also, we can learn from the past here as well, because there are old varieties out there that we have forgotten that are often more resistant, more resilient, that we can bring back in again. So using biodiversity in this sense as well to reduce the need for chemical inputs and also increase resilience to climate change.
Yeah.
Good, thanks.
Exactly.
All right. We soon need to sort of round this up. There's going to be a coffee break, and it will be from 3:15, and we will reconvene again at 3:45. But before that, I think that we should soon thank the panel, of course. But there's another panel after the coffee break. They will talk even more about sort of how to bring it to practice and policy. So do you want to send a question to the second panel? I'll ask all three of you. Lisen.
I can begin. So I'm wondering if this panel could address how you actually communicate the complexity and the system that we need to address. So communicating that when we only focus on carbon sequestration and cutting emissions, and then replacing fossil fuel with biomass fuel, for example, without addressing biodiversity, we run a risk of actually not being able even to address climate change. So we need to have the capacity to think about when we grow something here, that we actually both sequester carbon and provide all these other services connected to this land. So how do we communicate and address the systems perspective and identify the trade-offs and synergies between these different goals that we have?
Small question. Are you ready for that, Toby? Okay. Alexandre.
Yeah, I'm very curious to hear if there are any ideas about how to raise the topic of biodiversity to the same level of importance as climate change.
Good, thanks. And Camille, the last word.
Yeah, I'm very interested in hearing about, I mentioned a couple of things that we can do as individuals, but I would really like to open it up to other ideas or things that, what do people think is feasible to encourage individual citizens to do, and what do they think is really not going to work? So what are the workable solutions from an individual level?
Thanks. So, big hand for the panel. Thanks.
Tack så mycket.